Green from XR Today, bringing the latest in news and conversation for the extended reality space. Today I'm joined by Jenniffer Rodgers, IEEE's Executive Officer of its Learning Technology Standards Committee. Today we're going to be discussing XR going into 2023. Thank you so much for joining us today. And to kick us off, could you introduce the IEEE and what role the group is playing in the development of emerging immersive technologies?
Wonderful. Thanks, Rory. It's always a pleasure to be here and to share a little bit with regards to what's going on. So, to introduce the IEEE, I'm conscious of the fact that it's much easier to say IEEE, and so some of our colleagues don't actually know what that stands for. IEEE stands for the Institute of Electronics and Electrical Engineers, or Engineering. And it is the largest international professional organization for software and electrical engineers in the world. And we like to say that we're advancing humanity through technology. That's a big part of the role that we play. And so obviously XR plays quite a role in that space. There are a few different places where IEEE is engaged around XR, a couple that I'll highlight in this conversation. One, we have a digital futures group and community that is really looking at all of the emerging technology that plays a role in digital transformation, the future of work, all of those particular pieces. And as an extension or a complementary piece to that, we also have some places in the IEEE Standards Association that are working on pieces more specifically around what we need to make XR work going forward. For those of you that may not be familiar, IEEE is also the standards body that built the Wi-Fi standard and a lot of other standards that we use in our everyday life. So the IEEE definitely impacts you whether you know it or not. For the purposes of this conversation and where I think it gets interesting around XR, is especially around the idea that we're seeing a lot of use cases around XR for learning or training purposes or even remote operations support. And within IEEE Standards Association, we have a committee called the Learning Technology Standards Committee. Rory, you introduced that at the top of the conversation. And I think what's really interesting there is we are really seeing learning and kind of what learning means change as a result of some of the immersive technology that's come onto the scene. For instance, we've always kind of, I think in our heart of hearts believed that you learn by doing. We've talked about experiential learning and all of those different pieces. We didn't have the technology for a long time to be able to really measure what kind of learning people were actually gaining and maybe even skills that they were gaining through experiential experiences. Historically, it was a person observing you and maybe making some notes and maybe, filling out a rubric or what have you. But where LTSC, or the Learning Technology Standards Committee, comes into play is we're really starting to use the opportunity to bring together standards to make experiential learning measurable, and in turn make the skills that are acquired in that environment measurable and actually aligned and connected to different competency frameworks. That takes, it manifests itself in a few different ways. We can dig into that more deeply, but there are two standards, I think, in particular that really lend themselves to work that's happening in the XR space. The first standard is by far the one that will probably have the most impact in XR, and that is the XAPI, or Experience API standard. It already exists as 1.0, and 2.0 will launch in Q2 of next year, in 2023. It will be IEEE's first truly open source standard, so we are really excited about that. And the way that it manifests itself in XR is that the Experience API, or XAPI standard, is really open source. It's JSON linked data, and really what it does is it gives the opportunity to almost have a subject verb object kind of data structure, so that we can, in a common way, say, for example, Jenniffer picked up this item in this immersive environment and potentially it resulted in resolving a conflict that was happening in that environment or in that scenario, or even Jenniffer picked up this item and it improved an operational process or what have you. We have the data structure to be able to do that now. And really importantly, to attach human behavior to environment, to really show in a simulated environment or an immersive environment that the actions that the human beings are taking are having an impact on other human beings as well as the environment in negative or positive ways. And then really start to look at, are we starting to see a correlation between the behavior that humans take in an immersive environment and in the real world? And that's where, some of the interesting pieces between virtual reality and augmented reality, for example, help us to bridge some of those gaps. So it's very interesting. It's a common data standard. We've also worked a lot on, data security and privacy standards associated with that too. We feel that really having a common data standard gives people the opportunity to know what to expect around what's being measured and tracked within an immersive environment. And then most importantly, there's a second standard really a suite of standards that kind of come together to support that. And that really comes in the form of competency frameworks. So what are the frameworks that kind of articulate the skills that one would need for different jobs or opportunities? And how do we connect the actions that we're taking in the immersive space to potentially be partial evidence of a skill that you might need or have for an opportunity? That kind of comes together in another piece of work that's really kind of forming that really plays around the idea of almost a digital wallet for skills. And the reason that is so important is because there are lots of organizations and standards bodies across the world right now working on this for a few different reasons. One, to make opportunities more available to people and give them an opportunity to demonstrate the skill set that they have, regardless of what environment, what educational background they come from, what university they did or didn't go to, really kind of opening things up and giving people an opportunity to say, hey, I can do this. It doesn't really matter where I got the degree from or what part of the world I'm in. I've demonstrated that I can take the right actions to do the right thing. The reason the digital wallet piece comes into play is because essentially it is user owned. Right? So we're really trying to take, and this goes back to the open source piece, take the idea that your data is yours, right? You can use data from an immersive environment to the purposes that you would like. So for that example, to say, I've demonstrated some skills. I think that I should be considered for opportunities because I have demonstrated these skills. And I want to share these with this institution or this institution, but not this institution. So one of the ways that some of these standards come together that I think is really exciting for the immersive space is it allows people to, one, know what to expect around what is being recorded around their behaviors in an immersive environment. Two, be able to use those should they choose to be able to demonstrate evidence of skill set to hopefully gain opportunities or access to them. And then three, and most importantly, to control themselves who sees what data and for what purpose, which I think is hugely important to all of us in the XR space and definitely something that's on our radar from the IEEE perspective.
Fantastic. I feel that's a really great insight and a great breakdown of the group as well as its XR goals. And it sounds like there's a lot of hard work being done towards the elements that are behind the scenes. And it's also fantastic to hear what's going on in terms of 2023. And 2023 is holding a lot of opportunity and there's a lot happening in the immersive space, especially with remote communications and its kickoff post-COVID, notably, as you say, education and workplace sectors. The XR industry has evolved massively. So from your perspective, how do you feel like the XR industry for enterprise has evolved in 2022, the year that's just passed?
Yeah, I think it's been really exciting to see enterprise really start to understand more around some of the practical applications of XR. We all know that XR has been around for quite some time, and we've had enthusiasts, I would say, that have been part of this space for an incredibly long time. And because it has a lot of roots in gaming and, and aspects like that, I feel like it's taken us a little bit of time to be able to hit on the right use cases and to demonstrate the right value for our colleagues in enterprise to understand not only why they would invest beyond a small pilot, but how they would actually start to scale this and put it into practical application in these environments. For myself, I typically come from very large enterprises that are global, and infrastructure is always a challenge. Upfront investment is always a challenge. So it's really kind of an understanding of where to best support. I think some of the things that I think enterprise are doing that is really kind of moving the ball forward, I guess I should say, is really starting to focus in a little bit more in terms of not just, where we could use a particular technology geographically or even with a particular population, but very specifically, how are we augmenting the job itself that's happening in a positive way with immersive tech, right? And that sounds really simple, but it's not always simple. It's looking at potentially processes or routines that the workforce is doing that needs a little bit of augmentation. So maybe it's something they don't do very often. So it's hard to remember the exact steps. Or maybe it's something that's incredibly dangerous or not safe. And so we need to make sure that, potentially our colleagues have really simulated every potential scenario we can think of before they're in the real world environment. And then when they are in the real world environment, they have safeguards to be able to tell them when an environment is becoming increasingly unsafe. And I think, some of the connections that we're starting to see between the IoT world, so just the basic IoT data and instrumentation data that a lot of our enterprise colleagues already have around their operational processes, plays really well as we start to connect that to the human experience. So I'm seeing more and more organizations thinking about this idea of, okay, we know what's happening with operational processes. When they start to trend out of limit, and that could be unsafe or it could be inefficient, could lead to lower productivity or what have you, a human being typically has to intervene at that point, right? So, who is a human being in proximity or working on that piece of equipment? How do we support them maybe in an augmented reality or remote operations support kind of environment to help them know not only something's trending out of limits, but you need to take an action, and this is what this action should be. And then furthermore, in the VR space, how we simulate those environments prior to people being in the operational environment. I think we're getting there in terms of really making the connection between increased productivity and efficiency, as well as, sustainability, safety, all of those pieces, and getting beyond where we started. And I think that's important because a lot of what we typically saw in the beginning was, because there were no data standards, what we would call smile sheets or surveys, right? That would go out to people and say, well, do you think you're safer because you've done this immersive experience? Or their managers, do you think that Jenniffer has more skill because she's done this in an immersive environment? That's just really not enough. I think we've seen that across the board. It's why we struggled for a long time in enterprise to get beyond pilots. Human perception and self-report is really important, but we need more in terms of being able to correlate that to actual business environments and metrics. And so I think we're getting there. I'm excited to see it. The data standards, I think, will help tremendously in terms of even helping different pieces of software or applications within an enterprise environment talk to each other better. So for example, if we have instrumentation that's measuring the operational processes in the equipment, it can now be aligned or speak back and forth to potentially a learning record store that's recording what types of actions people are taking in an immersive environment. Furthermore, it can be connected into human capital management systems that talk about who has what skill set and whether they're prepared to do another job and things like that. So the emergence of the data standards, I think, are really helping in terms of connecting this in a more real world way for enterprise, because the gaming experience is fantastic. And I think that's gotten us to the pilot stage, but now we've got to actually be able to talk to the other systems that already exist in these large enterprises and be able to correlate the metrics.
That's fantastic, and it's a great perspective coming from the space of metrics and data. Going to the future of work idea, where companies like Meta are doubling down on scaling their product portfolio as an immersive workplace solution. So, how do you think companies have reacted to this new wave of tech? And do you feel like enterprise end users are going to continue to express interest in XR into this new year?
Absolutely. I think we see great uptake from a lot of our users in the enterprise space. I think some of the concern, particularly with some of the older workforce, is that they'll be reticent to the technology. I think what we see with XR is a lot, I don't think it differs too much from an age perspective in the sense that anytime anybody, I think, approaches a piece of XR hardware and they've never seen it, they've never worn it, and there's always a little bit of anxiety around that. But we find if people are supported in that environment, and I think on an enterprise scale, that's important, right? Because the introduction is hard when you have, for example, 100,000 people spread across 6 continents and things like that. But how you have that support process to get them into the tech and get them comfortable with it, it only takes a few seconds, as we all know. And once they have that support, it really takes off. I think you mentioned some of the providers. Obviously, the enterprise space is much, much more complicated than any other space because of some of the factors that play in. I've mentioned infrastructure in the past. So we still need increasing awareness by a lot of the providers in the space that, for example, if I'm operating in parts of South America or potentially in Africa or, things like that, we don't have the same bandwidth as we have the luxury of having in some of the more developed countries. And so there have to be solutions that allow for flexibility in terms of providing a similar experience across different geographies and potentially different access to infrastructure. The other part that I think is really important is just the management of it. And we've seen lots of great, providers come into the space like Cleanbox Technologies and things like that are really trying to solve for the idea of lots of people and management of devices. I think we could continue to see more on the platform side in terms of how to handle just the sophistication and the complication that comes with, having devices not only deployed, but maintained and operational, as well as accessible to people. That takes some management. I think the platforms are evolving. I'm really, really pleased to see that happening. And I think they will continue to do so. Obviously, on the security side, that's also, a primary focus.
Yeah.
But that said, we've solved for a lot of those things. I reflect upon a couple of weeks ago being at the ITSEC conference in Florida, which for those of you that don't know is a huge, big international conference, mainly focused on the idea between industry and defense primarily, and the ways in which we work together and collaborate together. Amazing XR applications happening in the federal, U.S. federal and military space. So certainly we're getting there in terms of the infrastructure to be able to support the security that I know that everyone is concerned about. And once again, I think the data standards help with that because it gives us an idea of what to expect and how to handle that data.
Fantastic. I like the fact you bring up the idea of regional accessibility too, because that's a key point in XR inclusivity. That is being approached, but it's nice to hear that that's a point of interest from the IEEE also. But I like to pivot slightly, and it does cross over to what we were talking about, because I like to discuss about the integrated technologies and, sorry, excuse me, what integrated technologies that you feel will significantly impact the XR market in 2023, and that could be software or hardware.
Absolutely. So on the hardware side, I know we're all keen to see, devices get more flexible, smaller, lighter, reduce the bandwidth associated with them, as well as, in my world, I tend to work in high risk, high compliance environments. So we're looking for as rugged as possible because the environments are tough. I think on the hardware side as well, particularly when we talk about environments that are outside, not in a building or in an indoor space, obviously we have a lot more work to do around that. in terms of making the devices and the fidelity such that it can be consumed in bright sunlight, for example, and things like that. So I think we're still working on that. Obviously, everything to do with, battery power, and all of those things come into play on the hardware side there too. And also just, all of the spatial visualization that comes into play. In my world, I get really excited about the advancements that we do see around some of the biometrics. I think that's incredibly important, particularly as we are talking about the idea of potentially attaching evidence or partial evidence of a skill to a person. We really kind of need to know that it's that person. And so biometrics in the devices also are a huge help to us to be able to do that. Obviously, we can plug in other biometric types of authentication that already exist within a lot of these operational environments, but it's great if we can just utilize the device itself to be able to do that. So love to see that continue to move forward. Also on the biometric side, when I talk about some of the data standards and we talk about the subject, verb, object, there's also extensions that go along with that. One is one around context. So if a human being is taking a particular action, in what context are they taking that action? And the biometrics that the hardware provides really gives us more around that. In the sense that, are we seeing that they're in a high stress environment? How do we know? Are we looking at, eye dilation? Are we looking at eye gaze? Are we looking at, potentially heart rate? All those particular things. I know everyone's been talking about this for a long time, but I'm encouraged by the fact that as we have a data standard that supports it all now, hopefully the hardware has a little bit of an incentive to really start to integrate that and build that in. On the software or platform side, once again, everything around scalability is incredibly important. I think the integrity of the experience, regardless of where someone is and what that environment is like, is incredibly important. And so everything that we can do to support that is fantastic. On the integration side, once again, great opportunities there, particularly as we start to see truly open source standards emerge, obviously with everything going on with Web3 and OpenXR, as well as data standards on the IEEE LTSC side and everything else. There's real opportunity once again to start to connect these experiences more broadly. I think for a long time we focused on, the individual having the experience, or if it was a multiplayer, the people in the experience having the experience in that moment. But from an enterprise perspective, we really need to roll that up much higher and really have the ability to aggregate more information about different experiences. For example, what actions am I consistently taking across different immersive experiences? What does that say? Even if they were provided by a different provider, which gets to reusability of objects, which I think is another piece that we're really hoping to see. We also have a learning object metadata standard within IEEE, and we're hoping that that can kind of help to be able to make these objects more interoperable across different experiences. But furthermore, I've kind of talked about the idea that we're really looking for integration of large applications that already exist within the enterprise space. And anybody, when you really think about it, would be very familiar with that, right? We have all of our core HR data or people data. You've got human capital management data around who has what skills and what jobs they are in and could be in. You've got operational or instrumentational data that comes from the IoT space. And we're already starting to see some of that around conversations around digital twins, depending on what people mean by that, and everything else. But what I really hope to see, and I think we will see as we start to move forward, is from a software perspective, using open source standards and really having bidirectional APIs that allow for some of these systems to talk to each other. Because what we're really striving for is the idea that we're continuously improving the experience for the person. For example, if they want to continue to build a skill set, how do we use the data that we already have around the actions that they've taken in certain environments, maybe even use some artificial intelligence or what have you, to either A, recommend to them, hey, we think you might have this skill because of some of the actions that we've seen you take, or B, here's the next experience that you should do to be able to build a skill set in an area that you want to build or grow, or even that the organization needs you to grow in as we look at the future of work and how jobs are evolving and changing. So it's incredibly important that these applications can talk to each other and not in proprietary data formats, so that we can actually make that experience available for people. Because I think that's what we all want from the metaverse, right? I mean, that's the idea of it, is that it's technology in service of humanity, helping people to grow and improve and have access to opportunity because of the technology, not the other way around. And so in order to really maximize the value for the individual or for humanity, we really need to see these systems, kind of taking down some of their walls and silos and actually working with other systems in data formats that are common.
I couldn't agree more. Interoperable, excuse me, systems are critical to the success of metaverse platforms on the whole. And the metaverse in 2022 was almost a buzzword. It grew in popularity so massively, not just in the XR space within its niche, but also in the mainstream. Following that buzz, what are your predictions for metaverse platforms?
Yeah. So I think you've mentioned this already, Rory. We've done a lot of work behind the scenes, to try to build the opportunity or the behind the scenes infrastructure for these things to actually talk to each other. Where I see 2023 going is really kind of capitalizing upon, the buzz that's happened and the interest and curiosity around the metaverse, as well as the beautiful community that I think we've seen emerge over the course of the last year or so, with people kind of getting it in terms of it's not just technology. In fact, the technology is just in service of helping people communicate and collaborate in different ways, breaking down walls and barriers around the way that we can be in a space together, and learn from each other and grow from each other and all of that. I've seen a lot of growth in just public awareness around that particular piece. I think we'll see more of it. I think we need to see more of it as we go forward. But I'm really encouraged by the idea that a lot of this infrastructure that has been kind of going on behind the scenes now has the opportunity to really make its way into implementation and start to really impact the experience that our users have. And that's what gets me really excited. When I look at the metaverse in 2023, I see people continuing to collaborate and work together, and build kind of what the metaverse is going to be. Because I think any of us that say that we know exactly what the metaverse will be right now are not necessarily being truthful, right? I mean, it's a community that's building things as we're going, and it's really great to see that discovery process and see what kind of bubbles to the top. So I think we'll see that. I think what's interesting and what to me, as a people strategist, is I think we'll start to see a lot more association, between the person and the technology, which is the spirit of the metaverse. But once again, we haven't had the data to be able to see it. What I see as a very real possibility as we go into 2023, and something that I get really excited about, is the ability for someone, regardless of where they are in the world and whatever their background has been, to be able to access a device, hopefully at low cost, and and that's really accessible to them. Be able to engage in some experiences that, either help them to demonstrate things they can do and skills that they have, or even build a skill set that they might not be able to do in the real world in their current environment, and then be able to actually potentially take evidence of that, put it in a digital wallet around the skills that they have or that they've gained, and be able to potentially apply for a job, using that as evidence for a skill set that they have. That's where I see things going in 2023 from a people perspective. And that's the part that I think is really encouraging for us, as we look at, once again, that practical application and further scalability, particularly of XR in the enterprise space.
Fantastic. And I think, it's very exciting to think about where the metaverse might go with open standards and perhaps more of a sophisticated look at the platforms, the ecosystem, and the infrastructure as a whole. But for those watching, what's the best way for them to keep up to date with all this hard work you're involved in?
Yeah, absolutely. So obviously you can reach out to me, on LinkedIn for any specific questions that you might have around anything that I've shared. It's Jenniffer Rodgers. But the best way to get involved, which is what I would prefer, is really to look at some of the IEEE working groups that we have. We have a whole suite of working groups within the Learning Technology Standards Committee. If you are passionate about standards, or you even want to contribute to what some of these standards should look like, work groups are open to anyone who would like to participate, and you can definitely get information about that on the IEEE website. That'll point you directly towards the LTSC, or the Learning Technology Standards Committee, which is part of the Standards Association. Also, as I've mentioned before, Digital Futures is a great community to get involved in as well. It's also an IEEE community, and does give you access to, speaking with others about where we're taking the applications, where we're taking the hardware, engage with industry around what it is they're looking for, and and what feature sets are missing. Those are all pieces that are really important as well. So I would really encourage anyone to please get involved. This is an action, or call to action, I guess, for anyone. We've got to build this thing together. And in order to do that, we need as many diverse perspectives as we can. And we would love for any of you to join us in our working groups or in our Digital Futures community to really continue the conversation and really build out what will continue to be standards that guide open source and the space.
Brilliant. All very exciting stuff. It's all very encouraging as well. I'd like to thank you so much for joining me today, Jenniffer. It's been a fantastic chat. That's it from myself. You can get more XR news by subscribing to our XR Today news channel and by following our social pages. I'm Rory from XR Today. Thank you very much for watching.